become the largest in the world. And it's really not a surprise here. Interestingly, as the U.S. slipped from being the leading economic power in the world, mainstream media has virtually ignored the story. I spoke earlier with the president of Euro-Pacific Capital, Peter Schiff. I began by asking him why the story is being ignored.
Well, first of all, I wasn't shocked by it. I've been expecting China's economy to surpass the United States. In fact, right now it's only surpassed it when you adjust for purchasing power parity. But I think maybe by over the next 10 years or so, it could surpass it without making those adjustments, just on a dollar level. And I think that will happen when the Chinese abandon their currency peg and allow their currency to rise. And I think it'll rise substantially against the dollar, and that will dramatically improve their economy. It'll improve the purchasing power of their citizens, and it will enable China to truly surpass the United States. And frankly, they might have already done that had they not adopted this foolish currency policy years ago.
Now, last year, it was China that surpassed the U.S. in global trade. Now, as we mentioned, it's in terms of goods and services. Are we getting kind of used to the idea that China is, as you mentioned, gradually over time kind of surpassing the U.S. on multiple levels here economically?
Well, I don't know that we're getting used to it, but we're going to have to, because I think ultimately it's going to mean a big diminishment in the standard of living for Americans when the Chinese reclaim their production for themselves and stop exporting what they make to America and stop loaning us all this money. You know, if you look at the most recent trade figures, China just posted its largest trade surplus ever. At the same time, America just posted its biggest trade deficit ever in manufactured goods.
All right, so let's talk about that for a minute, because I hear people say all the time, well, this doesn't matter. The only reason the Chinese economy is so large is because the U.S. buys all that stuff that China creates cheaply. As you're pointing out, eventually, though, that whole argument goes away, does it not? Because there is going to be a shift coming.
Well, China's economic growth is not thanks to our generosity in accepting all their output. It's their effort that produced it in the first place. It's Chinese factories. It's Chinese capital investment in Chinese labor that is growing the Chinese economy, not American consumption. I think, if anything, we're a drag on the Chinese economy. I think if China wasn't foolishly subsidizing American consumption, the Chinese would be enjoying falling domestic prices, and they would be buying all the goods that are turning out of Chinese factories, and their economy and their standard of living would be much stronger as a result.
Because that might be the case, do you think that China would then, at some point in the near future, decide to stop, as you use the word, subsidizing Americans with those cheap products?
Well, absolutely. In fact, that's why I think the Chinese have been accumulating so much gold, and why I think they continue to be big buyers of gold, is they are preparing to jettison the dollar as their principal reserve, and I think they're going to eliminate the peg. And again, when they do, that's going to be the birth of a new renaissance in China. You're going to really see China rise to a much greater degree, and that's going to be the sun setting on the American century. Because without China's support, we're going to have to finally deal with the problems that have been building up in our economy for years, but China has spared us having to deal with those problems.
Peter, the U.S. is in an interesting position right now, simply because there is not a single generation of Americans left who really remember what it was like for the U.S. to not possess the world's reserve currency in the dollar. It sounds like all of that is coming to an end. You mentioned that the sun setting here on the American century. As the sun is beginning to set on that, what do we have to look ahead to for the next decade here in the U.S.?
Well, a lot of it is going to depend on how we react to this, rude awakening that we're in store for. But I think Americans today, younger Americans, really have no idea of just how truly prosperous America used to be back in, the 1950s, for example. The real wealth of this nation that had been built up over years of free enterprise, limited government, sound money. We were a much stronger economy, and we lived a much higher standard of living. Remember, back in the 1950s, a man who didn't even graduate high school could support a family, support his children, support his wife who didn't have a job, save for retirement, not have debt. We had a true middle class in this country that had tremendous purchasing power and very little debt. And that doesn't exist today. I mean, a lot of countries have caught up to America because we've encumbered ourselves with so much government and regulations. But I think now some of these countries that have been holding themselves back are really going to increase their lead when they jettison this dollar system. So we're going to have to come to terms with this. We're going to only be able to consume in America to the extent that we can produce. And right now we can't produce because we don't have the capacity. We've got a bloated education sector and healthcare sector and service sector. Meanwhile, we've been gutting our industrial sector, and we've been relying on the generosity and stupidity of the rest of the world to produce the things that we can't and lend us the money that we don't save. And when we have to wake up to that reality, it's going to be a big change in America. And hopefully it will motivate us to make some key structural political changes that will unleash the free market spirit that originally built this country, and that is going to be so necessary to build it back up again after it collapses.
When you use the word collapse, we're talking about a monetary collapse, certainly, in terms of the dollar. What do you see moving forward in terms of alternative currencies, Bitcoin? Obviously, you mentioned gold a little bit ago in terms of older, more stable commodities. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be Bitcoin that replaces the dollar, but I do believe that other currencies will rise, and I do believe that gold will increase in importance, despite the fact that the Swiss unfortunately voted down backing their currency again by gold, which was the case in Switzerland up until 1999. I'm sure that eventually the Swiss, like many countries, are going to turn back to gold when the dollar collapses, and people really appreciate the reason that gold has been money for so many centuries and why fiat currencies have failed every time they've been tried. This most recent experiment with the dollar is not going to be the exception to the rule. So I do think you're going to see gold be a much more important reserve asset, and other currencies rise in importance, especially to the extent that they are backed by or maybe even redeemable in gold.
Peter Schiff, president of Europe.